Welcome back to the deep dive. I have to be honest with you right up front. The stack of papers we are looking at today is, well, it is disturbing.
Disturbing is a strong word, I think. I would probably say reorienting, or maybe structurally significant.
No, I am sticking with disturbing, because if what we are about to discuss is true, then my understanding of where I end and where the world begins is just completely wrong.
Mm.
We are looking at a document that claims your thoughts have a literal, measurable temperature.
Yeah.
And not in a poetic way either.
Right. It suggests that the boundary of your skin is essentially an arbitrary decision you have made, and that the chair you are sitting in right now is physically and psychically an extension of your own personality.
This is a lot to process. We're digging back into the Seth Material today. Specifically, we're looking at session 341.
Yes, and this is from the early sessions, book 8.
And the date of record here is May 15th, 1967. Now, before we get into the mechanics of how your brain might be a literal thermal radiator, we have to handle the housekeeping.
The important stuff, yeah.
We need to state clearly that this deep dive is distributed free of charge on all major platforms for educational purposes.
And we want to give full credit where it is due. The material we are analyzing comes from the New Awareness Network.
If you find yourself having a bit of an existential crisis while listening to this, or hopefully a moment of clarity, we highly encourage you to go to the source. Don't just take our word for it. You can find the books at sethcenter.com/the early sessions.
It is always better to read the original text yourself. We are just here to help unpack the really dense parts and maybe connect a few dots.
And the mission for today is specifically to look at the mechanics. Because usually with this kind of material, you hear the slogan, you create your own reality, and it sounds nice, it sounds empowering, but it also sounds like a metaphor.
Exactly. It sounds like positive thinking. It sounds like a bumper sticker. But in session 341, Seth drops the philosophy and acts like an engineer. He breaks down the actual assembly line. He explained exactly how a non-physical thought creates a physical object.
So let's start at the very beginning of that assembly line, or I guess the non-beginning, because the first concept Seth throws at us is this idea of constant creation.
He says, and I'm quoting here, creation is constant. Due to the nature of action, creation cannot be anything but simultaneous.
Okay, pause there. Simultaneous. This is where I usually get stuck. Because to me, life is a sequence. I wake up, I stub my toe, I curse, I make coffee. That is a sequence. A happens, then B happens. If creation is simultaneous, why does it feel like a line?
That is the core illusion Seth is trying to dismantle. Think of it this way. Imagine a stone thrown into a pond. The act of the stone hitting the water happens in a single instant. That is the creation point. But the ripples, they travel outwards. They take time to reach the shore.
So we are living in the ripples.
We are inside the system, experiencing the expansion of the action. Seth argues that every act of creation opens up new dimensions of activity. To us, it looks like time passing. But from the perspective of the creator, the consciousness throwing the stone, the action is unified and instant.
That helps. It is like watching a movie. The film reel exists all at once in the projection booth, but I have to watch it frame by frame to make sense of the story.
That is a really good analogy, and Seth is basically taking us into the projection booth today.
So we have this constant simultaneous creation occurring. But how does that turn into the coffee mug on my desk? Seth lists out a hierarchy here that is surprisingly technical.
It is a translation process. He is describing how energy steps down into solid matter.
Right. He lists it. Inner data, then thoughts, then images. But he makes a really weird distinction here. He seems to be saying that thoughts, like the actual words running through my head, are actually the least important part of the process.
Least important in terms of creation power, yes. Seth calls thoughts translations and symbols for the ego. They are highly physically oriented. They are just the labels we put on things after we have felt them.
So if I am sitting here thinking, I am wealthy, but I am feeling a knot of anxiety in my stomach.
The thought is just surface noise. It is a symbol. Beneath the thought, you have the image. Seth says images are more basic, more emotionally charged. They are closer to the engine room.
But even the image isn't the bottom layer. And this is where the title of today's deep dive comes in. Seth talks about temperature pictures.
This is the key technical insight of the whole session.
I need you to break this down. Because when I hear temperature picture, I think of a weather map. Or maybe a thermal camera showing heat leaks in a house.
It is actually not far off. Seth says, and let me quote this precisely because it really matters. Behind these, so to speak, exist what you may term temperature pictures, in which delicate gradations of heat form ever-shifting emotional patterns.
Gradations of heat. He's talking about literal heat. Thermodynamics.
He appears to be literal, yeah. He says these patterns have a semi-physical outline. This is the bridge. We tend to separate physics and psychology. We think emotions are in here and heat is out there. Seth is saying that at the foundational level, an emotion is a thermal pattern.
So when I get angry and I say I am heating up, or if I give someone the cold shoulder,
We think we are just using metaphors, but we might actually be describing the literal thermal mechanics of consciousness.
that is wild. So before I have a thought, and even before I have a mental image, I have a heat signature.
Yes, the raw consciousness translates into a thermal intensity. That intensity is the blueprint. Seth explains, from these, you see, normal images are built up, and from the images, thoughts are formed.
So the heat cools into an image. The image gets labeled with a thought.
Correct. It is like casting metal. The molten metal, the heat, comes first. It pours into the mold, the image, and then it hardens into the object, the reality we experience.
And he locates this in the body, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't just say it happens out in the ether. He points to a specific part of the brain.
The old brain.
The primitive brain, the lizard brain.
Exactly. The parts of our brain responsible for basic survival, distinct from the neocortex where we do our complex reasoning. Seth says these thermal pictures are received and processed by the old brain, and the body responds to them with, you guessed it, temperature changes.
Which create chemical reactions.
Right. So you have a non-physical emotion. It manifests as a thermal signal in the old brain. That thermal signal alters the temperature of specific neural clusters, which triggers a release of chemicals, hormones, neurotransmitters.
That is the moment. That is the smoking gun. That is where mind literally becomes matter.
It is the interface point. It is where the ghost pulls the lever in the machine.
He uses a great example to illustrate this too, the worm.
The worm is the perfect example of efficiency in this system.
Seth says, in, for example, the worm, the process ends here.
Meaning, the worm receives the thermal picture, danger, food, heat, cold. The chemical reaction fires. The worm moves. Done.
The worm isn't sitting there thinking, I wonder if I'm moving fast enough.
Mm-hmm.
Or what will the other worms think of my technique?
No, there is no translation into complex symbols or language. The thermal data leads directly to action.
But we are higher forms, so-called.
So-called. I love that Seth keeps us humble. For us, the chemical process continues. We take that raw signal and we build it up into an ordinary image and then into thought processes.
We make a story out of it.
We elaborate. We add layers of meaning, judgment, and analysis.
But here is the kicker. Seth implies we don't actually need to do that to function, consciousness-wise.
He says all of these procedures are unnecessary to consciousness itself. Consciousness perceives directly. It doesn't need the thermal map or the chemical reaction to know what is happening. Those are mechanisms for the physical body.
They are the user interface.
Exactly.
And it's like, okay, imagine I'm using a computer. I'll click on a folder icon. I don't need to know binary code. I don't need to know the voltage running through the silicon. I just need the icon. The icon is, for me, the user, to interface with the machine.
And in this analogy, your brain is the monitor. The thermal pictures and chemical reactions are the code running in the background. Your consciousness is the user. The thoughts and words are just the icons on the desktop.
That makes total sense. But it also implies that we are often distracted by the icons and ignoring the code running underneath.
We get lost in the translation. We obsess over the thoughts, not realizing they're just echoes of the thermal pictures deep in the old brain.
Okay, so that is the flow from inside to outside. Mind creates heat, heat creates chemistry, chemistry creates experience. But it is not a one-way street, is it? We aren't just projectors, we are also cameras.
Right. There is a feedback loop. This is crucial for learning.
Seth says the brain looks out upon the physical universe, and consciousness then reacts.
So let's trace the reverse path. You touch a hot stove. That is a physical experience. The nerves fire. The brain registers pain. But how does that physical pain get stored in your non-physical soul? How does it become part of you?
It has to go back up the assembly line.
It has to be translated back into the language of consciousness.
So physical experience to thought, or inner image to thermal image.
It gets stripped down, the words fall away, the visual image dissolves, it becomes that raw emotional or thermal pattern again. Then it goes a step further into what Seth calls intuitional form. He describes this as highly condensed and codified.
And finally, pure experience.
Or electromagnetic purity.
I highlighted that phrase 3 times, electromagnetic purity. It sounds like something out of a science fiction movie, but he is talking about memory, isn't he?
He is challenging the entire neuroscientific model of memory here. We tend to think memory is stored in the meat, in the synapses, like writing on a physical chalkboard.
But Seth is saying the brain is just the processing plant. The storage is somewhere else.
The storage is in the electromagnetic field. The data is compressed. Think about a zip file on your computer. You take a massive video file, gigabytes of data, and you crunch it down into a tiny package of code. You can't watch the zip file. It is just code. But it contains the potential for the whole video.
So my memory of my 10th birthday party isn't a video reel playing in my head. It is a zip file of electromagnetic energy.
Exactly. Seth says, all of the information of the inner self is highly condensed and codified and exists in electromagnetic purity. When you recall the memory, you are unzipping the file. You are expanding that electromagnetic signature back into a thermal pattern, then into an image, and finally into a thought.
That explains why memory can be so visceral. You know how sometimes you smell something like fresh-cut grass and suddenly you feel exactly like you did when you were 12? It is instantaneous. You aren't remembering the scene linearly. You are getting hit with the thermal picture.
You are accessing the direct data before it gets translated into a story. You are feeling the electromagnetic purity of that moment.
This model of the mind, it changes how I see myself. I am not just a biological machine. I am an energy system interacting with a biological machine.
We are the ghost in the machine, but, and this leads to the next section, the machine is also made of the ghost's energy.
Right. This is the part of the session where I started looking at my furniture suspiciously.
The living environment.
Seth decides to completely dissolve the boundaries of the human body. He says, you arbitrarily decide on the personal physical image as the exterior boundary of the self.
Arbitrarily. That is the key word. We decided, okay, everything inside this skin is me. Everything outside this skin is not me.
It seems like a pretty logical decision to me. I mean, if I pinch my arm, I feel it. If I pinch the table, I don't.
Seth would say that is just a limitation of your focus, not a reality of your existence. He says, in actuality, no such physical boundary exists.
Now, where do I end?
Literally, you don't. You extend to the ends of the universe. But Seth explains that if our physical brain tried to process all of that sensory data, if you felt the wind on Mars as clearly as you feel the wind on your face, you would be catatonic. You couldn't function.
So the ego is basically a set of blinders.
It is a focusing lens. We block out 99.9% of the universe so we can navigate this specific room. But the connection is still there, and it is strongest with our immediate environment.
He talks about ownership, and this really made me think. He says, the environment is simply an extension of the self, hence your ideas of ownership.
Why do we feel we own something? Is it just because we paid money for it? Seth suggests it is deeper. We recognize our own energy in the object.
So my favorite chair, the one I sit in to read, I feel like it is mine because I have effectively colonized it with my thermal patterns.
You've materialized it into your sphere. Seth says the stuff of physical materialization is in itself conscious and alive.
Wait, the stuff, the wood, the fabric.
Yes, it is not dead matter. It is vibrating energy. And when you bring it into your life, when you surround yourself with it, it resonates with your frequency.
This creates a living environment.
It creates a feedback loop. You project your personality into the room holds that charge. Then when you walk back into the room broadcasts that charge back to you.
So if I am depressed and I sit in my room being depressed for a week,
you are saturating the psychic climate of that room with depressed thermal patterns.
And then if I leave, feel better, and come back in,
the room might literally bring you down. Not because of the lighting or the mess, but because the objects are radiating that stored depression signal back at you.
My furniture is gaslighting me.
Or it is just faithfully mirroring you. It gives a whole new meaning to clearing the air, doesn't it?
It really does.
Yeah.
It suggests that cleaning or redecorating isn't just aesthetic. It is psychic hygiene. You are disrupting the old patterns.
Seth also uses a much more serious example to prove this point about boundaries. He talks about epidemics.
Yeah, this part is sobering. He asks, essentially, if we are all separate, sealed-off biological units, how do mass contagions work?
Right. If the self stops at the skin, a virus is just an invader. But Seth implies that on a biological level, we are open systems. We are continuous with the environment.
You can see this, for example, in epidemics.
The implication is that we are all swimming in the same soup. When the soup, the collective environment, changes, it changes us because we are it. We aren't separate from the ecosystem. We are the ecosystem expressing itself as a person.
It connects back to the idea of the collective unconscious. Seth brings up Carl Jung here.
He does. He gives Jung credit. He says Jung was correct in postulating a collective unconscious.
But there is always a but.
But with his limited knowledge, he did not see that this unconscious would exist outside of your three-dimensional system entirely.
Poor Jung. Limited knowledge.
Seth is respectful, but he is pointing out the ceiling of 20th century psychology. Jung saw the archetypes, the shared symbols we all dream about, but he thought they were buried in the past of the human brain.
And Seth says,
This collective unconscious holds the future as well as the past.
whoa, hold on. The future.
If creation is constant and time is an illusion, then the future exists now. The collective unconscious isn't a history book. It is a design lab. It contains the blueprints for what hasn't happened yet.
That is a game changer. It means we aren't just pushed by the past, we're being pulled by the future.
And we are participating in it. Seth calls it interactive creativity. He says you constantly add to the collective unconscious and constantly receive from it. You change what you receive, however.
We aren't victims of the archetypes, we are editors.
We take the energy, we filter it through our own thermal pictures, we change it, and we feed it back into the system.
This circles back to the furniture again, surprisingly.
How so?
Well, Seth says each physical object has a psychic effect on all other objects. There is constant interaction. Just like we interact with the collective unconscious, our lamp interacts with our table.
You are right. It is the same principle, just different scales. A room full of antiques creates a dense psychic climate because of all the history and emotions stored in those objects.
No wonder antique stores feel so heavy. You're walking into a storm of frozen thermal pictures from strangers.
And conversely, why a new, sterile office can feel dead, it hasn't been charged with enough life yet.
Okay, so we have covered hot thoughts, living furniture, the user interface of the brain, and the collective future. It is a lot of theory. And usually, this is where a skeptic would check out. They would say, cool story, prove it.
And this is where session 341 takes a sharp turn.
The test.
Seth stops lecturing on metaphysics and starts acting like a psychic spy.
He starts listing letters.
Yeah?
Specifics. He says S and A and G or C or Z.
He is fishing for a connection, and he links these letters to a specific event. A letter written to Rupert, that is his name for Jane Roberts.
And also a letter written by that same individual to someone else.
Yeah, usually in these sessions, the validation comes later, but in the notes for this session, we get the receipts immediately.
Enter Reverend James C. Crossan.
Let's look at the data. Seth said G or C or Z, Reverend Crossan, C. And the double S in Crossan gives that Z sound.
Seth mentioned a letter to Jane.
Jane received a letter from Reverend Crossan the very next day, May 16th.
Okay, that is impressive, but it could be coincidence. Maybe she was expecting mail. But here is the part that genuinely gave me chills. Seth mentioned a letter written by the same individual to someone else.
This is the critical piece of evidence. Jane did not know this. She had no way of knowing this. But much later, in 1968, she found out that Crossan had written to an editor at Doubleday.
A publisher.
He wrote to them suggesting they look at Jane's book. He was acting as a secret agent on her behalf.
So Seth, speaking through Jane in a trance, knew that a man miles away was writing a letter to a third party. A letter that Jane physically knew nothing about.
It validates the entire theory we just discussed.
Connect the dots for me.
If the self has no boundaries, and if the collective unconscious holds the future and exists outside of time, then accessing information about a letter being written is not magic. It is just networking.
The thermal picture of that letter was already in the system.
Precisely. The intent was there. The electromagnetic signature was there. Seth didn't need to see the physical paper. He read the zip file before it was even fully downloaded into physical reality.
It really drives home the point that we are operating in a much, much larger system than we realize. We are obsessed with the physical moment, the delivery of the mail. But the information was already there in the electromagnetic purity of the network.
It suggests that privacy, in the strictest sense, is an illusion. On the inner levels, we are all broadcasting our intentions.
That is both comforting and terrifying.
It keeps you honest.
So what do we do with this? We have looked at the mechanics, we see the machine. How do we drive it better?
I think it comes back to the thermal pictures. It means we should pay more attention to the temperature of our own minds.
Yeah, if my thoughts are just the final label, I need to look underneath them.
Exactly. You can force yourself to think positive thoughts all day long, but if your thermal engine, your old brain, is churning out heat patterns of fear, resentment, or lack.
That is what is going to materialize.
That is what is cooling into the physical objects around you. You are populating your room with objects and situations that resonate with that vibe.
It also makes me look at my environment differently.
Yeah.
If I'm feeling stuck, maybe I need to change the psychic climate of my house.
Move the furniture, get rid of objects that hold negative charge, introduce things that resonate with who you want to be, not who you were.
Because the feedback loop works both ways. Change the outside to change the inside.
And realize that you aren't isolated. You are connected to the collective. You have access to information and creativity that is far beyond your little ego's capacity if you are willing to quiet down and listen to it.
This has been heavy, but in the best way.
It is a lot to process.
And look, we barely scratched the surface. We gave you the highlights, but Seth goes into so much more detail.
We really did just skim the top.
So again, please, go read the real thing. It is the Seth Material. This was session 341. You can find these books at sethcenter.com/the early sessions.
Support the New Awareness Network. They are keeping this material alive for us.
And remember, we are doing this deep dive for free, for education, because we think this stuff matters. It is not just about ghosts or psychics. It is about understanding the nature of being human.
It changes how you view the world.
So here is my final provocative thought for you to chew on as you go about your day.
Let's hear it.
If your environment is an extension of yourself and your thoughts generate thermal patterns that become matter, what is the temperature of the room you are standing in right now saying about your current state of mind?
That is a chilling thought.
Or a warming one. Depends on the room.
Fair point.
Thanks for diving deep with us. We will see you next time.
Take care.
Bye for now.